Hi, I'm Chris Martin, here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with my friend Jason Dobney. You know, I've been coming to this museum since I was a little kid, and the thing that I appreciated about being in this room was that there was always a Martin guitar or two on display. And the reason that is because Martin guitars started in New York City 181 years ago. My great-great-great-grandfather opened a shop at 196 Hudson Street. Now, I've given tours of our museum for many, many years, and I would stand in front of the first showcase and tell my visitors about CF apprenticing with his father as a cabinet maker, becoming intrigued by the guitar, moving to Vienna, studying with Johann Stauffer, learning how to build Stauffer-style guitars, coming back to Markirchen, not feeling comfortable there, and then ultimately sailing across the Atlantic in 1833. And then I would move to the next display, and I would talk about the guitars that he built at the Cherry Hill location, and then moving downtown into Nazareth. And for all those years, I never thought about why on earth did the guitars in the first display case look so different than the guitars in the second display case. Fortunately, a book has been written that tells that story. And Jason, you have a copy of that book, don't you?
I sure do. It's an absolutely gorgeous book that came out in 2013, edited by Robert Shaw and Peter Zago. And it's really the research that went into this book. It was a whole team of people looking at all of the surviving guitars as well as records that your family has kept, and really figuring out what happened. Like you said, what happened between that first case and that second.
Significant changes there.
And it happened. A lot of it happened here in New York, and so that's why we're very pleased to have about 35 guitars by your great-great-great-grandfather. It's the largest collection of his ever assembled for public display, and it's a thrill, actually. Such a great craftsman. And of course that story about how he went from the Viennese guitar, which a lot of decorative features, but very importantly the ladder bracing inside. And then in New York he saw Spanish guitars, which were fan braced, and it's really that combination that led to his great invention that I know you talk about a lot.
And you know, what inspires me is as I think about his ability to look at the marketplace, to look at what he was making and say to himself, the market is not interested in what I'm making, so maybe I should make what the market wants. And what was happening at that time was that guitars were being made in Spain, particularly along the Mediterranean in Cadiz, right? And the Spanish deserve a lot of credit for really looking at the guitar and saying, how can we refine this? How can we make it better? You know, the guitar itself, its origins go back to Mesopotamia, right?
Guitar-like instruments, really.
But along the way, and particularly, I guess, probably in the 1700s, that's when it really became that instrument we know.
Yeah, for sure. Six-string right around 1800, a little bit before that. And then of course, the Viennese and the Spanish both have their own traditions.
Yes.
And what's so great, it's not just that he was a great businessman that said, I'm going to make Spanish guitars because that's what people are buying, but he was such an entrepreneur to look at the two bracing patterns and many other features and figure out that an X bracing, I guess that's to avoid the pin bridge. I think you talk about that.
Yeah, that's what. So early guitars, the back of the guitar has transverse braces. It's my understanding that guitar tops also had transverse bracing at one point, which I don't think is very good for tone.
Right.
So is it true then that the Spaniards were the first one to say, okay, a transverse brace up underneath the fingerboard, acceptable. A transverse brace right below the sound hole works, but let's get that third one out of the way and put fan bracing.
Right, help the tone travel, keep the solidity of the guitar. And then of course your great-great-grandfather figured out that the X bracing would keep that pin bridge from going through the transverse.
But that was a gradual.
Very gradual.
The one thing that we struggled with when we're helping to gather the information for this book is there's a large gap in our records, and we have really good records. And Mr. Boak is here with us. Dick, where are all those records? What happened to them?
We're looking for them.
Yeah, we're still looking, so if you see them on eBay, let us know. So, okay, so CF's in New York, and he's looking at the Spanish guitars that are being imported, and there's a couple of them here, aren't there?
Yeah,
several
several of them,
Spanish guitars
yeah.
here. And I think what was happening was that if those guitars had stayed in southern Spain, they'd be fine. They come to New York, they experience a winter like we did,
Absolutely.
and they weren't holding up very well.
Yeah. Nor did I during this last one.
Yeah, I know, it was tough. So now here's CF, he's got this, Germanic perspective on woodworking, having built furniture with his father, studied with Johann Stauffer, learned how to build a guitar, and saying, okay, I can build a better mousetrap. And I think that's what he did, and that set the foundation for the level of quality that all of us are held to today when we make a Martin guitar. I honestly, I can't make a better Martin guitar than he did. I'm fortunate that I have the opportunity to make more of them. I could make a worse one, that wouldn't be too hard, but he really set a very high standard. The funniest thing to me is how he pretty blatantly copied the Spanish guitar.
Absolutely. I mean, he just built a direct copy
Yeah.
and marketed them to the Spanish playing community. And what I love about the guitars, you can put a Spanish up next to a Spanish Martin or Martin
Okay.
Spanish,
Yep.
and you can tell his are so nicely made
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you can tell that part of it.
Yep.
But then there's this whole era of experimentation. Some of my favorite guitars in the exhibit, we have about 3 of them or so, where he's just thinking, and you can almost look at the guitar and see his thought process.
Yep.
Some strange looking guitars, but
Yeah.
still beautiful.
Yep. And that's often the case with the founder of a company. Not only are they entrepreneurial, they're very curious. They're like, okay, what do I do? Where do I take this thing that I'm doing for a living? So let me talk a minute and help me here if I get this wrong about how the Spanish build their guitars. The one thing is their necks are longer, right? And the body block is often part of the neck, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you're going to really build a Spanish guitar the way the Spaniards do, you start out with a longer piece of wood, most of which is the neck, but the bottom part is the body block, and that secures the neck to the body, but in this case, it's actually part of the neck. You cut a couple of slots around the side, right? Bend your sides and then attach them basically to the neck early on in the process. Well, CF, again, being a cabinet maker, very familiar with the dovetail joint, and if you've seen them, pull out the drawer of an old piece of furniture and you'll see the little dovetails. Used it on the Stauffer guitars and said, okay, I'm not going to copy the way the Spaniards assemble a guitar, and it has served us very well. If you come to visit, and I hope you do, in Nazareth, you will see we build the body and the neck separately. We're not working with something 2.5 feet long. We're working with 2 separate pieces until one of the final points. But in order to mimic, and this is one of the funniest things, the look of a Spanish guitar, he put a false Spanish foot on the back, and I just think that's hilarious.
Yeah, he didn't want to change his construction methods, but he wanted it to look
Right.
like.
Right.
One of my favorite details on those Spanish guitars he made, he copied the 2 holes drilled in the top of the headstock, where they used to hang, the Spanish styles, they would hang the guitar on the wall. And he actually put the 2 holes in there too, the same way.
Why don't you do that in the museum?
Yeah,
Why don't
well.
you just hang the guitars on a nail on the wall?
I think we'll not take that advice.
All right. So what else? Okay, so he's got the little foot there, Spanish heel, which is still a significant design feature today of the Martin guitar, and the rectangular headstock.
Rectangular headstock,
Yeah.
yeah.
I didn't realize until Dick and I had a chance to spend some time in our museum with James Westbrook, and he was the first person that said, Chris, did you realize that when you have a guitar with a Stauffer style headstock, and if you come to visit or if you get here to the Met, and you see the tuning gear mechanism, extremely complicated and ornate, they were half the price of the raw materials on a fine guitar. So by moving away from that, and they also were sourced from Europe, and going to the rectangular head, he was able to, on the plain guitars, use friction pegs, which I guess were sort of mezza-mezza, or the 3-in-line tuners, which I think were simpler to manufacture and
went towards, yeah.
a little bit less expensive.
Of course, and then everything from materials too. I mean, the rosewood back and sides, that's a Spanish feature that adjusted. So,
So Jason, and people ask me this, where do you think that started? That someone, obviously it was trial and error, but at some point they said, let's make a guitar out of rosewood, mahogany, ebony, and spruce because those are the best woods. How far back do you think that goes?
Oh man, well, the Viennese, of course, used maple sides and back, and that's from the fiddle tradition.
Okay.
You know, the great Cremonese artists used
right.
spruce tops, maple sides and backs. So when did they get the rosewood? Probably after the Spanish had the New World, and then they just found this is a beautiful wood. I think was part of it was an aesthetic, and then it works so awesome for the music. But trial and error. I mean, it's
and you know, whoever figured it out, and no one has come up with materials that actually do work better than the very traditional materials you still see today on a finely made guitar. So we've talked about some of the things that you can see on the outside of a guitar. As you mentioned, probably the most significant development was the X-brace. And it's been a question. Again, you know, CF didn't keep a diary. You know, we have records of, you know, what did we sell, what did we make, but we don't know what his thought process was. And I think the book does a fantastic job of walking you through how did he go from fan bracing to X bracing. And it's my understanding that it was a very practical issue in terms of him moving back and forth. He would make guitars with the tie bridge,
which was a Spanish feature,
and guitars with a pin bridge. Apparently also he would move back and forth early in his career between steel and gut string, which again I wasn't aware of. There were, you know, there were steel strings available, but of course if you were making a copy of a Spanish guitar, it had to be gut strings. And what we think was happening, and you know, back then, the guitars ended up being precise because of your hand and your eye. And towards the end of the process, it's possible that you need to make an adjustment to line everything up. So we think what might have happened is if he's making a pin bridge guitar and he's got these fan braces down there and he's got to move something around, and what might have moved around was the bridge a little bit. So he's got the bridge on, the bridge is now mounted, and one of the final steps is to drill down through the tops. So he's got his drill, he's drilling for the bridge pins, and he feels a little more pressure. What am I drilling through? I've drilled through the spruce top. And we think he might have drilled through a brace. And from a very practical standpoint, he said, that's got to stop.
Yeah. So then, of course, you take the fan bracing and you get rid of the middle fan and you start experimenting with the famed Martin X bracing.
Spreading it out. And then at some point, don't you think he said, well, instead of that other transverse brace, why don't I extend these guys?
Exactly.
Crisscross them, get some support below the sound hole, which you need, because that's kind of a pivot point in terms of the tension. And what we also think that the Madame Dugoni guitar was the first example of that.
Well, at least the earliest we can date now.
So far.
But the book, again, it does a great job. It has all these diagrams that shows you sort of the experiments and how this works out. And then
which you have here. You have graphic displays of those.
Exactly, which I think really helps see how this you know, went on for a period of years, this experiment. And then the Madame Dugoni, of course, the first sort of prototype that we can find with X bracing, which is a fantastic guitar. And then what's interesting, and the book shows, the other American makers started copying him with the X brace, like right away. I mean, there was no like protection of your design. So one of the other things about your great-great-grandfather I wanted to mention, three greats, is that not only was it this innovative construction, but he was a real artist as a maker, and even experimented with this sort of the decorations of the guitars. So you have the wood choices, of course, that we've mentioned, but some beautiful examples of inlays around the sound holes, ivory fingerboards.
And I have to believe that goes back to Stauffer, that he saw Mr. Stauffer be successful making fancy guitars and learning how to do that, you know, and to make it not only structurally sound but aesthetically pleasing.
Oh, just beautiful, and that's really what makes them the art pieces that stand out in a museum like this and in this gallery of art pieces. And so anyway, in the exhibit, we lay this whole story out. We start with the Viennese style, we show the Spanish influence, and then of course this American style that the book calls it. So I think you can get that, what we've just talked about, right here.
And then I guess by the 1850s, he had really begun to pick and choose which aspects of the Spanish guitar to keep. And that's how you can begin to see, okay, now Mr. Martin is really defining what an American guitar is using parts of the Spanish design that were appropriate to keep and jettisoning some of those that didn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, no, and then that's his style, and that's the Martin guitar, and I think most people would recognize those instruments as Martin guitars to this day.
Right.
Yeah.
So who knows, had he not done that, who knows what the Western guitar would look like today? It's
Of course, then all of that design, the X bracing, the whole thing, that really made the guitar strong enough. So when steel strings became the accepted method, it was the game in town. It was the design that worked.
And there was so if we fast forward to the 20th century, there was a transition period there where we moved away from gut and went pretty wholesale into steel strings, and I'm sure that was another period of trial and error. How much more durable do we need to make the guitar to withstand the pressure from a set of steel strings versus gut strings, knowing that ultimately you wanted the guitar to sound good at the end of the day. Anyone, Jason, anyone can build a guitar that is durable. The challenge is to build a durable guitar that sounds great, and that's a very you're almost and I know I've said this before, but and I'm not being cheeky about it, but a really good guitar is built so that it is on the verge of self-destruction.
And I've heard that from other makers before too. I think that's very interesting.
And if you get it wrong, you have a very unhappy customer.
So it's a thrill to have you
at
the museum.
Thanks. This is a really special exhibit. It runs through
December 7th.
December 7th. So if you get a chance, come on up. And while you're in this room, check out
all our other cool stuff.
Oh man, centuries of musical instruments that reflect man's desire to make music.